Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Now, it was a valiant attempt to reform a broken power structure, in this case, a notorious unit of the Nigerian police force known as the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, or SARS. A year ago this week, tens of thousands of young Nigerians, feeling emboldened by what they'd seen other black people doing around the world through the Black Lives Matter movement, took to the streets to demand an end to police brutality. Both the Black Lives Matter movement and the EndSARS protests were spearheaded by young demonstrators who were fed up and wanted to transform their world for the better. Both took advantage of the benefits of a global audience and the commonalities they shared with one another to press their case, with prominent Black Lives Matter activists such as Alicia Keys, Kerry Washington and Danny Glover demanding justice over the treatment of people during the EndSARS protests. For Black Lives Matter, highlighting injustices on the African continent was part of its wider mission to intervene in violence inflicted on black communities by the state everywhere.
Stand united in our call for accountability,
respect for human rights, and justice.
We demand justice, and we demand it now.
Nigerians are rising. Africans are rising. The diaspora is rising.
And so we call on all of our elected leaders to rise and listen to the people.
Our lives matter. Stand united in our call for accountability,
respect for human rights, and justice.
And of course, Opal Tometi, that you saw there, is a co-founder of the Black Lives Matter movement. She's been on this program and she's changed her name from Opal to Ayo to strengthen her connection with Nigeria. Well, for more on the nexus between the EndSARS protests and the Black Lives Matter movement, I'm joined now in the studio by the lawyer, development practitioner, and former commissioner of the Washington, D.C. Commission on African Affairs, Chime Asonye. Thank you very much indeed for coming in.
Thank you, Charles. It's great to be here.
What do you remember of those EndSARS protests that took place a year ago this week? What were you doing?
I mean, what I remember is people losing their lives as they took to the streets to demand for change. And for me, it wasn't academic. When people think about the Lekki tollgate shootings, for instance, they think about the 10 or so people that they say died there, but a lot of people don't know that on the day of the tollgate shooting, there was over 40 people killed across Nigeria, from Kano to Abuja to Lagos. And in Abuja, in Apo, where I live at, there was actually 5 people killed. So I remember thinking about people demanding for change, wanting police accountability, wanting their rights and larger human rights respected by Nigerian security forces, and really wanting to challenge where we were right now. And it was such a beautiful movement, thinking about young people taking to the streets and saying that there is no leader. This is decentralized movement for advocacy and change. And so I was really inspired by that. And I think most of us are thinking about what Nigeria could be versus where we are right now.
Right. Without dwelling so much on the issue of people dying and so on, just to make the point that up till this stage, it's still not ineluctably clear how people died, who killed them, and what happened, and so on. So we need to be clear on that. But what parallels are you able to draw between the EndSARS protest movement and the Black Lives Matter movement, beyond the fact that the BLM helped to mobilize international support for EndSARS?
I think there's a lot of parallels, and just on your point about we don't know how people passed away. We don't know, which is why we hope that the panels continue to investigate and that we get more understanding and of context, who shot Live Avenue missions, et cetera. Different international bodies have said different things, but we haven't had a final question, which is one of the reasons why we need to push, because that truth needs to come out and people need to understand. But the parallels between EndSARS and Black Lives Matter are a lot. First of all, the New York Times says that Black Lives Matter was the largest civil rights protest in America's history. There's polling done last year, and it said that between 15 and 26 million individuals participated. In one poll, that is 10% of Americans that participated. And if you look also at the New York Times, it looks at EndSARS, and it says that EndSARS were the largest protests since our democratic dispensation in 1999. So when you see the gravity of individuals getting out to march for change, that's one of the connections. Another important parallel is that the diversity of the movement. In Black Lives Matter, one of the differences, so Black Lives Matter started in 2012 with the killing of Trayvon Martin, and it was really reignited years later with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and things like that when they were killed in 2020. And 2020, we see that repetition happen with EndSARS. We've seen EndSARS disbanded, that started in 2014. Every IG police chief essentially disbanded it from 2015, 17, 2019. It's this repeated call for justice. But later on, you saw a huge protest movement saying that we need change and enough is enough right now. With EndSARS, you saw at least protests happening in at least 25 of 36 states. In the 2020 Black Lives Matter movement, with the reincarnation, you saw that one of the big changes was a lot of white individuals actually participated.
Absolutely.
In later on, before it was a little bit taboo, people were scared, but then there was a realization that the call for justice is a universal struggle. So I think that the diversity, the continued march and demands for change, and also the huge nature of the EndSARS and Black Lives Matter show the parallels that are going on across both sides of the Atlantic.
That's a brilliant analysis. And what do you think that global mobilization achieved with regard to the objectives of the EndSARS protest? Not so much the Black Lives Matter movement, but the EndSARS protest.
Well, we know that the EndSARS protest had specific demands. And some of the demands were restitution for victims. Some of the demands were accountability for individuals through the investigation and setting up the SARS, dissolving SARS
unit.
What we saw in October of last year is that the federal government dissolved SARS and reincarnated something called SWAT. There's still a question about who these individual police officers, did they get the right psychological training before they were incorporated, and things like that. So we've seen these panels set up in different states, but I think that we're still waiting for a lot of these panels to finish. And a lot of these different places that they've been set up, they've been disbanded, or sittings have been disbanded. You've seen it in Anambra State, that you've seen that in Lagos recently. So you haven't seen that continued march for justice or these demands happen. And then the larger point about outside of accountability of police forces, and there is the larger part about human rights and individuals being treated fairly. I think that we're still thinking about how we can push, or even electoral reform issues, getting more young people involved.
Well, that was going to be my next point,
okay.
Because that's a very interesting issue that you raised there. Because, for example, in America, while Black Lives Matter appears to have moved from the political wilderness to the center of America's conversation about itself, I think you mentioned that in one of your articles, could the same be said about the EndSARS protest movement? Because the way to measure that would be the transition from being a street protest to being a kind of political movement that's harnessed the potential of the demographic potential of the young people in this country in a political way, measurable through the elections.
Well, I think that change looks different in different places based on local context. When change happened with Black Lives Matter in America, one of the big differences between 2012 and 2020, for instance, when the first Black Lives Matter started, was that you had big institutional anchors that supported the movement later on. So this was like the NFL saying, standing in support of drivers and saying that they would ban Confederate flags that are coming in. This was like other NFL individuals standing in support of players and their protests and things like that. So one thing that we need to think about in the context of EndSARS is, who do we have here? What kind of institutional levers supporting the demand for rights. Do we have an NFL talking about this? Do we have the equivalent of a NASCAR talking about that? Who are those intellectual pillars? And you mentioned my article. I recently wrote an article on Brookings about this. And
I saw that.
One of the vehicles, one of the institutional anchors I think that we need to be thinking about is the creative space. So one of the things that we saw during EndSARS movement is people like Flavor and Fino protesting in Anambra and Enugu. We saw Davido protesting in Abuja. We saw Mr. Macaroni, who's a famous comedian on Instagram, and
Falls and people like that.
and MI taking to the streets. We saw Tiwa Savage talking about this online. How I personally think that the fourth estate is not necessarily the media, no disrespect, but it's these artists that people emulate.
Well,
that
the
have
fourth estate in this context.
In this context, is these artists, is the movement for change, is the creative sector, and thinking about how arts can really change things. And then the other thing I was going to say is that one of the things that is really prolific about arts is how it can be used to commemorate and through song and things like that. So even when we think about our spaces in Abuja, do we have monuments to protesters, right? Do we have other cultural museums and things like that to some of these advancing of movements? These are the type of conversations we're going to have. Art played a huge role in the Black Lives Matter movement.
But that's likely to be afterwards rather than before. You see what I mean? In other words, when you've achieved the objectives that you've set out to achieve and you've effected transformation, then retrospectively you're much more likely, because having transformed the mindset of the people who are in politics, who are the ones who will implement what you want, you're more likely to then sort of have them say, yes, we need to set up monuments in respect of these people.
Well, I mean, that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is that people died at Lekki Tollgate, and that's a fact that's indisputable. And they died marching for the rights and using creative civil disobedience and music to try to support change and things like that. So when we look at it in that way, context, that's why, like I said, artists can be used as one micro vehicle to either express and live their memory in song. I know individuals are thinking about how they will commemorate things with protests here in Abuja.
Right.
And one way they're thinking about doing that is on the 16th, which is when you had the day of commemoration a year ago.
Right.
Thinking about how they'll gather together and support different things going forward.
Stay with us. We're going to come back in a minute. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we remember the EndSARS protests a year ago this week and the nexus between those demonstrations and the Black Lives Matter movement. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Now, my current guest is the lawyer, development practitioner, and former commissioner of the Washington, D.C. Commission on African Affairs, Chime Asonye. He watched, as did millions of others, as a year ago this week, tens of thousands of young Nigerians made history with the EndSARS protests against police brutality that swept the country and shook the Nigerian establishment to the core. The demonstrations drew a parallel with the Black Lives Matter movement, both spearheaded by young demonstrators fed up with the status quo, both notable rallying cries by Africans across the world. Well, today, 12 months on from EndSARS, we are assessing the parallels between those two movements, how much they overlap, and to what extent they've succeeded in forcing change with their protests. And the lawyer, development practitioner, and former commissioner of the Washington, D.C. Commission on African Affairs, Chime Asonye, is still with me in the studio. Thank you for staying with us. Beyond the fact that both movements were originally fighting against police brutality, but then went beyond that to attack more fundamental issues of government and equality and all the rest of it. They were united in fighting for black humanity, weren't they? Albeit in different regions of the world. And I think one of your articles also touched on that.
Yes, exactly. Fighting for it in different ways. So let's talk about America. With the Black Lives Matter, one of the things you see is the Breed Act, which is trying to essentially, I don't want to call it divest, but reorient funds from the police forces to social services and healthcare and education. The Breed Act has been introduced into Congress. It has been passed. We saw more fundamental change. We had senators. So we had Representative Karen Bass and Senator Cory Books talking with another Republican senator, and they were trying to pass reforms to police and chokeholds and create a national database for individuals of police brutality. That hasn't passed. So there's still a long way to go with Black Lives Matter. Here, I think it's the same way. We've seen calls for broader reform of the police. We've seen that we've seen SARS disbanded, but I think that people want larger reforms in the police. We've seen these investigative panels come up, and I think that's one of the things that people would have liked perhaps is there have been a central place where some of these investigations, so people don't have to concentrate on 36 investigative panels, but one.
Yeah, that's a good point.
In particular, because if you actually look at the 5 demands, what it calls is for an investigative body, not an investigative series of bodies, right? And it's made it difficult. I might concentrate on Abia because I'm from Abia, and I know other people I work with concentrate on their particular states. But when we think about it in general, it's hard to focus on Lagos and Ogun and things like that.
Well, actually, there is a Human Rights Commission investigation, which is supposed to encapsulate or encompass the entire country, but it's kind of petering along, if you ask me.
And a lot of people aren't paying attention to it. I think that most people are paying attention to what's going on in Lagos.
Yeah,
and
Lagos was the big one, wasn't it?
Yes, and I think that that's why your people are talking about there's going to be more protests and movements as we've come for a year later to remind individuals to foreground these particular demands. And this is even in the face of commissioners of Ogun State and Lagos State saying that they are not welcoming any protests and things like that. I still feel like young people want to make their demands heard and commemorate or do different things to say that this issue is still important to us.
Yeah, but what concerns me is what happened to all that energy? I mean, as we were saying during the break, it just seems like it's an anticlimax, and you would have thought that there would be a greater push in a direction that would try to consolidate change. And one way to do that, I mean, the young people here are the most important, the biggest demographic, is to try and get into the political arena. Is that something you're seeing happening here?
That is something I'm seeing, to be honest, especially here in Nigeria. We have a lot of focus on the different elections that are coming up, whether it's an Anambra or Not Too Young to Run movements. We have different calls for the Office of the Citizen. Organizations I'm involved in, like Debate Nigeria, are trying to get young people to talk about policy solutions, focus on the Niger Delta and nationwide, and debate these policy proposals. One of the things that we as young people, as I put myself in that category, is we need to understand legislative development processes, but we also need to understand political development processes because we've made demands, but how are those demands executed?
Absolutely.
The example I gave to you is of the investigative panel body. That's a political question with specific policy implementation ramifications. So there's a big difference between 36 investigative panels that you're looking at and one, which is the National Human Rights Body. A lot of people aren't focused on the National Human Rights Body, right? So if we have conversations about these political processes and understand the affirmative and negative ways we can implement them, then I think that we'll really get support and understand that. And then just on a final point about this, your point about electoral reform is very important and young people engaging in politics. From 18 to 35, we have over 50% of young people that are, so we could really change voting and the political process if we mobilize, right, and say these are our political priorities and we're going to vote for those individuals who really reflect the reality we want to see in this country.
That's a very interesting point. But what about within the Black African and Black diaspora communities? Did these protests forge greater unity between the two black worlds, if I could call it that, bridged perhaps by Nigerians like yourself, for instance, who straddle both communities, the Nigerian Americans?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not just Nigerian Americans, but Nigerians globally. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. One reason I will come to is what I'll call aesthetics and creative arts. That help show solidarity from different sides of the world. So whether it was, you mentioned how singers from Alicia Keys and others were talking about Black Lives Matter, is the same way artists. And music is a universal language. So there was that connection where people can think about, they can listen to a Falls song about this is Nigeria and want change. The second thing is technology really helped. So we saw in during the Lekki Toll Gate, DJ Switch was using her Instagram Live to broadcast what was going on so everybody could feel invested in the situation. But you see other types of technology, whether it's digital currencies like Bitcoin, when different actors, global actors wanted to support different movements here, they switched at one point from using Naira and things like that or dollars to Bitcoin and other currencies too. And then also the social media hashtags and continuing that conversation. So I think that technologies has helped, but you've also seen very material implications of that. You mentioned Opal, for instance, changing her name
to
Ayo, right? That identity and that connection, and then working with something called, people know her as Black Lives Matter founder, but she also helped support something called Diaspora Rising. And she mentioned in that video that people are watching, right? That Diaspora Rising, it's about drawing those connections and really getting political power within these institutions.
Yeah, it's very interesting watching her because, I mean, she personifies, that whole thing, doesn't she? I mean, she used to be Ayo Tometi, she's now Opal Tometi. I mean, she used to be Opal, she's now Ayo. And she's one of the co-founders of the Black Lives Movement, but also happens to be of Nigerian extraction.
Exactly. And look at the change that she's helping personify. And the other thing is, what is in a name? What does it mean to change your name to identify?
Well, it's to try and identify, isn't it? Yeah.
To this country, which shows you that symbolic change is material, because for her, it's affirming, it's calling her an advocate. So how can we catalyze political subjectivity of others? I think one way we do that is social consciousness. I've actually founded something called Niger DC. It's an organization. We have hubs in Abuja, Washington DC, and Lagos. It straddles both sides of the continent, and we share information about news and social consciousness that are going on, so we can catalyze that information and that connection to the continent and hopefully bring about larger change.
Now, you said in one of your articles that pursuing, okay, I've just been told where I couldn't hear anything.
Okay,
but listen,
okay.
I want to thank you very much
No
indeed, Chime Asonye, for coming in. Very interesting talking with you. That's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja, bye-bye, and thank you for watching.